I was sipping lemonade in my own backyard pool when a woman I'd never met shouted at me from behind the fence that I was violating HOA rules and would be fined for unauthorized swimming. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. Then she whipped out her phone, took photos of my pool, and stormed off muttering something about bylaws. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of a war I never asked for, and by the end of it, she'd regret even learning my name. After 30 years in the city and 2 in a cramped condo with shared walls and nosy neighbors, all I wanted was peace and a little privacy. When I found a property just outside the edge of a small suburban HOA development, I thought I'd struck gold. It was a clean 2-acre lot with a modest single-story house and plenty of room for the in-ground pool I'd always dreamed of. According to county records, the HOA didn't cover this parcel, and my realtor even joked that I'd be close enough to benefit from their manicured roads without having to answer to their board. That was the kind of detail I liked. The pool itself was nothing extravagant, just a clean tiled lap pool with a shallow end for the grandkids, a little waterfall I built myself, and a wooden deck where I could read the paper and eat grilled cheese sandwiches. I had it inspected, permitted, and installed by local contractors with everything filed properly with the county. No leaks, no hazards, no complaints, at least not until Karen showed up. Karen arrived 4 days after the pool was filled. I was watering the hedges when I heard a cheerful voice call out, "Good morning." I turned to see a woman in a sun hat, bright coral lipstick, and a pastel blue pantsuit walking up the driveway with a white basket wrapped in cellophane. I assumed she was a neighbor and smiled. She introduced herself as Karen, president of the HOA, and handed me the basket, which was mostly crackers, a packet of local honey, and a trifold pamphlet labeled Community Harmony Guidelines. Her smile was tight and controlled, and her eyes kept darting past me toward the backyard. I thanked her for the welcome, but when she asked about my pool registration, I blinked. I explained that my property wasn't listed under the HOA's jurisdiction. Her smile wavered. She told me that all water-based amenities must be reviewed by the Amenities Committee, and that the HOA had final say on landscaping aesthetics, noise levels, and pool fence materials. I calmly informed her that my fence met county safety standards and that I wasn't in her HOA. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly and left. I thought that was the end of it. 3 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox with a bright red stamp across the top. It was from the HOA and titled Notice of Violation. The fine listed was $500. The reason given was unauthorized pool construction and failure to file HOA amenity application form S-72. I laughed out loud, walked back into the house, and called the number at the bottom of the page. I asked to speak with someone who could explain why I was being fined by an HOA I didn't belong to. The woman on the phone told me I should attend the next HOA meeting to clarify things. So I did. The meeting was held in a small clubhouse at the entrance to the neighborhood. It had a fake fireplace, folding chairs, and a laminated poster with the phrase, "Keeping Our Community Beautiful." I sat in the back and watched as Karen opened the meeting with a speech about maintaining uniformity and protecting property values. When it came time for open discussion, I raised my hand and introduced myself. I said there had been a mistake about my pool and that I wasn't part of the HOA. Karen interrupted to say that the HOA guidelines extended to all recreational water features within a 500 feet radius of the shared path. I asked for a map or bylaw that showed that. She said the wording was being updated. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Karen wasn't interested in facts or boundaries. She saw a man enjoying his own space without needing her permission, and that bothered her. I left the meeting with half the room staring at me like I'd set up a nightclub in my backyard. The next morning I received another fine, this time for non-compliance and disrespecting board leadership. That's when I contacted my lawyer. We reviewed the deed, the zoning documents, and the original HOA charter. It was all clear. My land had been carved out of the HOA when the original developer sold the final plot. I was exempt from their oversight. The only reason Karen thought otherwise was because her map hadn't been updated in decades. I smiled as I read the confirmation, but I didn't rush to tell her. I figured she'd show her cards soon enough. That weekend, my granddaughter turned 7. We invited a few family friends over for cake and pool time. Nothing loud, no music, just 6 kids laughing, parents chatting. Karen showed up around 4 o'clock and stood behind the fence with her phone out, filming us like we were criminals. 10 minutes later, a white SUV from code enforcement pulled up. I met the officer at the gate and showed him my permit. He nodded, made a few notes, and walked off. Karen shouted after him that I was operating a pool club. He didn't even look back. After they left, I walked to the fence where Karen still stood, arms folded. I asked her politely not to come onto my property again. She told me I was being watched. I told her I hoped she liked the view. Then I turned and walked away. That night, I opened a beer, sat in my favorite chair, and watched the sunset from the edge of my deck. I had a strange feeling in my gut, not fear exactly, more like anticipation, because something told me Karen wasn't finished, and neither was I. It started early one morning when I heard the sound of a car door slamming near my fence. I looked out the window and saw Karen standing just beyond the gate, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 HOA board members. All 3 of them were wearing matching polos with the HOA logo stitched into the chest, like they were on some kind of official mission. I watched as Karen pointed at various parts of my backyard, then held up a measuring tape like she was calculating some crime scene dimensions. One of the men with her took photos with a tablet. I walked outside, calm but curious, and asked what exactly they were doing. Karen informed me they were conducting an HOA inspection and would be issuing a secondary violation for unauthorized fencing, non-compliant water usage, and unapproved gatherings. I told her, once again, that I was not part of her HOA and had no obligation to comply with any of their nonsense. She replied that we would let the courts sort that out and walked off. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one carried a fine of $1,000 and an official threat of legal action if I did not pay within 10 days. The reasons listed were even more ridiculous this time. Unauthorized water feature, violation of sound ordinances, endangering neighborhood children by maintaining an unsupervised body of water. The absurdity would have been funnied if I wasn't starting to feel the weight of her persistence. I contacted my lawyer again, and he confirmed what we already knew. I owed them nothing, but that didn't mean they wouldn't keep trying. To make matters worse, Karen began a smear campaign in the HOA newsletter. She published an open letter warning residents about a property on the border of the community whose occupant had repeatedly violated the spirit of community guidelines. She didn't mention me by name, but she didn't have to. She described the property as having a pool with a waterfall feature and a wooden deck, and included a line about unsanctioned pool parties with unsupervised minors. I found the newsletter on my driveway, folded in half, with a sticky note that read, "Just trying to help." That was the day I realized she wasn't just playing by HOA rules anymore. She was inventing them as she went. Still, I refused to let her win. I started documenting everything. I mounted cameras around my backyard and installed motion sensors near the gate. I printed out the original property records showing my exclusion from HOA jurisdiction and kept them in a folder near the door. I even started recording every conversation I had with her. Not that she ever said much when a camera was pointed in her direction. Karen was careful when she thought people were watching, but bold when she believed she could get away with things unnoticed. Then came the pool party incident. My neighbor Todd, a kind man who kept to himself and grew tomatoes on his patio, asked if he could bring his niece and nephew over one afternoon for a swim. They were visiting from out of town, and the neighborhood pool had just been shut down for repairs. I said, "Of course." We grilled hot dogs and made lemonade, and the kids splashed around happily while Todd and I sat in the shade. Karen showed up 20 minutes in, standing just beyond the fence again, phone in hand. I greeted her politely, asked if she needed something, but she just muttered that she was documenting unauthorized activity. 10 minutes later, another car pulled up. It was code enforcement again, same officer as before. He asked a few questions, looked over the pool area, and once again I handed him my permit. He gave a tired nod, said everything looked fine, and left without taking any action. This time, Karen was furious. She stomped down the sidewalk, yelling into her phone about officials being too lazy to do their jobs. Todd looked at me and shook his head. He had lived in the neighborhood for 7 years and told me Karen had once fined a neighbor for planting the wrong color roses. That neighbor had eventually moved. I told Todd I wasn't going anywhere. He smiled and said he was glad someone finally stood up to her. Later that night, I sat down with my laptop and dug through the HOA's public documents, meeting minutes, financial records, archived newsletters. I spent hours reading every line. Eventually, I found what I was looking for: a document from 1992 detailing an annexation error during the development of the final phase of the neighborhood. My parcel, along with 2 others, had been excluded from the HOA due to a surveying mistake. The original developer had filed an amendment, but it was never incorporated into the final charter. As a result, my property was never subject to HOA governance, even though it sat adjacent to the community. The county had confirmed this years ago when I bought the land, but seeing it in the HOA's own paperwork felt satisfying. I printed everything out and added it to my growing file. I knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. She had built her entire identity around being in charge. People like her didn't back off because they were wrong. They dug in deeper. Still, I now had the evidence I needed to fight back, and I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to make sure she couldn't do this to anyone else. The next day, I sent a certified letter to the HOA with copies of the documents and a formal statement declaring that all further attempts to fine or regulate my property would be treated as harassment and trespassing. My lawyer co-signed the letter, and we mailed it with tracking. 2 days later, Karen showed up at my gate again, this time with a forced smile and a passive-aggressive tone. She said the board was reviewing my case and wanted to find a harmonious resolution. I told her there was no case. There was only a person pretending to have power she didn't. She frowned, glanced at the security camera blinking behind me, and left without another word. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking up to check the backyard. But I had a feeling the peace wouldn't last long. Karen was quiet now, but that just meant she was planning her next move. The silence lasted for about a week. No knocks on the gate, no letters in the mailbox, no HOA board members standing by the fence with clipboards and cameras. It felt suspiciously quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before a storm rolls in. I spent the mornings tending to my garden, cleaning the pool, and tinkering with a little solar-powered irrigation system I had been meaning to finish. I was half hoping the whole thing was over, that maybe Karen had finally realized she was barking up the wrong tree. But deep down, I knew better. People like Karen didn't retreat unless they were planning a comeback. Sure enough, she returned, and this time she didn't come alone. I was inside reading when the motion alert chimed. I looked at the screen and saw Karen at the gate again, this time with a younger man I hadn't seen before. He wore a dark green polo shirt and khakis and held a small satchel under one arm. Karen gestured toward the gate, clearly explaining something with animated hand movements, while the man took notes. I stepped outside and asked if I could help them. Karen gave a thin smile and introduced the man as an independent compliance consultant hired by the HOA to perform a review of neighborhood amenity conflict. I reminded her once again that I wasn't part of the HOA and that she was trespassing by entering my driveway uninvited. The man glanced at her, clearly confused. She muttered something under her breath, then claimed they were on a public easement. I informed them that the entire driveway was privately owned land. After an awkward silence, they both turned around and left without saying another word. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my mailbox, not mailed, taped. It claimed that due to continued non-compliance and refusal to engage with community leadership, the HOA had approved a $5,000 fine and would begin the process of lien filing should the matter remain unresolved. I called my lawyer immediately, and he assured me that any attempt to file a lien would be not only baseless, but also illegal given my property's status. He suggested I send an official cease and desist and offered to handle it personally. I agreed, and by that afternoon, the letter was prepared, notarized, and delivered. It stated clearly that further attempts to enforce HOA rules on my land would result in civil action and that trespassers would be dealt with accordingly under state law. At this point, I had no doubt Karen was furious. Her attempts to bully me had failed at every turn, and the legal wall was now up around my property. So I decided it was time to build a physical one too. I called a local fencing company and commissioned a custom-built 8-foot iron privacy fence around the pool area, complete with a locked gate and security lighting. Installation took 3 days, and by the end of the week, my backyard looked like a fortress. It wasn't the aesthetic I had originally planned, but at this point, I needed peace more than decoration. The fence also gave me one unexpected benefit. I no longer had to see Karen's sour expression every time she passed by. The night after the fence went up, I hosted a small barbecue for a few neighbors who had become friends during the ordeal. Todd came by with fresh tomatoes from his garden, and an older couple from down the street brought lemonade and peach cobbler. We laughed, shared stories, and toasted to finally reclaiming our space. Just as the sun began to set, someone suggested lighting a few sparklers left over from the 4th of July. The kids ran around the yard waving lights through the air while we watched from lawn chairs. It felt like the first normal evening in months. The next morning, I woke up to sirens. 2 fire trucks and a sheriff's vehicle were parked at the end of my street. I stepped outside to see what was going on, only to be met by one of the firemen asking if I had lit fireworks illegally. I explained the situation, showed them video footage, and provided the receipts for the legal sparklers we had used. The sheriff shook his head and muttered that they had been called out for nothing again. Karen, it seemed, had called in a noise complaint and claimed there had been a fire hazard. The officials were not amused. One of them mentioned that this was the 3rd time they had been called to my address for nothing. I asked if there was anything I needed to sign. They said no and left. I waved goodbye and went back to my coffee. That day, I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I wasn't going to just wait for our next move. I returned to the county records office and requested a certified parcel boundary map, along with a copy of the original development annex. I assembled all the documents, highlighted key clauses, and prepared an informational packet. Then I sent a copy to each member of the HOA board, excluding Karen. I included a cover letter that explained my property's legal status and stated that any further harassment would be publicly documented and, if necessary, litigated. I kept the tone polite but firm. I didn't want to burn bridges. I just wanted them to understand that I wasn't bluffing. A few days later, I noticed something interesting. 2 board members came by separately, each under the pretense of a casual neighborhood walk. One of them stopped to admire my solar irrigation setup. The other complimented my tomato plants. Neither mentioned the HOA. Neither asked about the pool. It was subtle, but I could tell they were distancing themselves from Karen. Maybe they were tired of being dragged into her vendetta. Or maybe they had finally seen the documents and realized she had overstepped badly. Either way, I welcomed the change. Then something strange happened. My security camera picked up movement late at night. At first, I thought it was an animal, but when I checked the footage, my stomach dropped. The lock on my backyard gate had been cut clean through, and the pool area was in disarray. The garden hose was unwound and flung into the water. The deck chairs were overturned, and what looked like bubbles were rising from the pool. I ran outside with a flashlight and found the pool foaming. Someone had poured soap into it, not just a little, a lot. The filter was humming, the water cloudy with foam, and the waterfall gurgled like a washing machine. I reviewed the footage frame by frame. A figure with a large hat, short frame, and the same blue windbreaker Karen always wore was clearly visible near the gate, crouching, cutting the lock, and moving stealthily. I backed up the clip, enhanced it slightly, and froze the frame. There was no doubt in my mind. It was Karen, and now I had her caught on camera breaking and entering, vandalizing my property, and tampering with my water system. This time, she had gone too far. This wasn't just a petty HOA dispute anymore. It was a criminal offense, and she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of real consequences. The first thing I did was call the sheriff. I sent them the security footage, the still images, and explained everything over the phone in a calm but serious tone. The deputy who arrived later that afternoon was polite and professional, but his eyes widened slightly when I showed him the video of Karen sneaking through my gate with bolt cutters and dumping soap into the pool. He watched in silence, arms folded, then gave a slow nod. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him I absolutely did. Enough was enough. He filed the report and said they would follow up with her. As he left, he assured me that what I had provided was more than enough to justify charges for trespassing, vandalism, and property damage. For the first time since this battle started, it felt like the law was finally on my side. That evening, I cleaned the pool myself. I didn't want to wait for a professional, and something about scrubbing away the mess helped clear my thoughts. The soap had gummed up the filters and caused the pump to stall, but I got it working again. I drained the worst of the foam, rinsed the tiles, and refilled the water. The whole process took hours, but I didn't mind. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat down with a cold drink and stared at the now clear water. I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was focused. Karen had crossed the line, and I was going to make sure she couldn't keep doing this to anyone else. The next morning, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They confirmed that they had spoken to Karen and that she had denied everything, claiming she had never stepped foot on my property. When they told her about the security footage, she backtracked and said she had merely been checking for safety violations after hearing a noise. They informed her that wasn't her job, nor was it legal, and that further investigation would be conducted. I asked if I could get a restraining order, and they said yes, given the evidence. By that afternoon, I had filed for a temporary order and scheduled a court date for a formal hearing. Karen was served the paperwork the same day. 2 days later, Karen retaliated the only way she knew how. She held an emergency HOA meeting and tried to turn the entire board against me. According to one of the neighbors who attended, she stood at the podium and dramatically claimed that I was a disruptive presence in the neighborhood, that I had created a hostile environment, and that I was refusing to cooperate with the values of the community. She accused me of recording people without permission, threatening board members with lawsuits, and even suggested that I had tampered with HOA property. But this time, her speech didn't land the way she hoped. Several residents stood up and challenged her. Todd reportedly asked why she had focused so much energy on someone who wasn't even in the HOA. Another woman brought up the fire department's repeated visits and how each one had been a false alarm. Karen tried to cut them off, but the room was turning. People were tired of the drama, tired of the fines, tired of her. That same night, a neighbor I barely knew knocked on my door and apologized for not speaking up sooner. He said he had received 2 bogus fines over the last year, both for petty things like leaving his recycling bins out an extra hour. He said Karen had told him if he complained, his dues would mysteriously go up. More and more stories started to come out. Late fees that didn't add up. Notices with Karen's signature but no board approval. It was starting to look like she hadn't just been harassing me. She'd been using her position to bully and manipulate half the neighborhood. I compiled every message, every complaint, and every incident into a single document and sent it to my lawyer. He advised me to file a formal complaint with the county zoning board and the state HOA oversight office. We did both. The complaint included video footage, written testimonies from residents, financial irregularities from past newsletters, and copies of her false violation letters. We also reached out to a local reporter who had covered HOA abuses in the past. She was very interested. Within days, a blog article went live titled, "Man Fined for Swimming in His Own Pool," complete with screenshots from my security footage and a photo of the violation notice. The article gained traction fast, especially after it was shared by a few neighborhood Facebook groups. The headline alone was enough to make people furious. The comment section lit up with similar stories from across the country. Karen tried to deny everything, but the story had already spread. She was contacted by the reporter for comment and gave a short, defensive statement that only made things worse. She claimed I was a troublemaker who had been attacking her leadership, but the evidence was too strong. The photos, the letters, the video of her in my yard. Public opinion turned quickly. I even received a few letters of support from strangers who had been through similar experiences in other towns. Then came the turning point. The county board announced a formal audit of the HOA's operations, and Karen was suspended from her role pending investigation. The board was forced to hold a community vote to determine whether she should remain president. The vote was public, and the result was decisive. Karen was removed, with over 90% voting in favor. A new interim board was established, and their first act was to issue a formal apology to me and to every homeowner who had received questionable fines over the past year. They invited me to attend the next board meeting and speak about my experience. I politely declined. Instead, I spent the evening with my granddaughter, floating in the pool under the string lights I had hung around the fence. We listened to music and ate popsicles and laughed about how grown-ups could be just as ridiculous as kids. For the first time since I moved in, the air felt light again. No tension, no second-guessing every movement. Just peace. Karen, for her part, didn't show her face in the neighborhood for a while. I heard she was staying with her sister in a nearby town and had put her house up for sale. No one seemed sad to see her go. In fact, several neighbors told me they were thinking of throwing a goodbye barbecue just to celebrate the end of her reign. I didn't attend. I had no interest in revenge parties or mocking someone who had already lost everything she tried so hard to control. I had my space back, my pool, my garden, my quiet evenings with lemonade and a book, and that was more than enough. The following week, I decided it was time to ensure my peace wasn't just temporary. Karen may have been voted out, but the damage she caused left a long shadow over the neighborhood. I didn't want to spend the rest of my retirement waiting for someone else like her to rise up and stir trouble again. So I started reinforcing the boundary lines around my property, not just legally but physically. I hired a contractor to install a second layer of fencing where the community path passed near my land. This one would be motorized with coded access and a steel sign bolted to it that read, "Private land, no HOA access beyond this point." The workers arrived early in the morning, and by evening, a solid black gate stood between my backyard and the neighborhood trail that Karen's friends often used as a shortcut. The reaction was immediate. Some neighbors applauded the move. They waved and said it was smart to put up clear markers now that the lines were being drawn more openly. Others whispered that it felt like a wall had gone up between them and the illusion of community. I didn't mind either way. I wasn't trying to divide people. I was just trying to protect myself from another invasion disguised as a neighborhood concern. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the pool skimmer, I heard footsteps near the new gate. When I looked up, I saw Karen standing just outside the barrier, arms crossed, her face twisted into something between disbelief and indignation. She called out that this was public access and that I had no right to restrict it. I calmly walked to the gate, pointed to the county zoning map posted beside it, and told her she could file a complaint if she liked. She said nothing and walked away. The very next day, I noticed a fresh social media post in the neighborhood group from an anonymous account, ranting about fences going up and turning friendly walkways into fortified compounds. The tone was familiar. Too familiar. It didn't take long before another post appeared, this time more aggressive. It claimed a certain pool owner was acting like a king and refusing to participate in neighborhood unity. Comments poured in, some supportive, some sarcastic, and some just confused. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The facts were on my side, and the more she ranted from the shadows, the more she exposed herself. Later that week, 2 men from the new HOA board came by and asked if they could speak. I invited them onto the porch and offered lemonade. They sat awkwardly, shifting in their seats, and finally, one of them cleared his throat and said they were hoping to convince me to take down the second gate. They claimed it sent the wrong message. I listened quietly, then asked if either of them had received fines under Karen's leadership. They looked at each other and nodded. I told them that was exactly why the gate was staying, not out of spite, but out of a lesson learned. If clear lines had been drawn sooner, a lot of trouble could have been avoided. They didn't argue. Before leaving, one of them admitted he understood and that he would have done the same thing if he had been in my shoes. That weekend, I hosted another small gathering. just close friends and a few neighbors who had supported me during the mess. The grill was hot, music played softly, and kids swam in the now pristine pool. Just before sunset, I unveiled something new, a large inflatable sign floating in the middle of the water that said, in bold letters, "Not your pool." The adults roared with laughter. Even the kids thought it was hilarious. Todd nearly choked on his drink. It was light-hearted, but it carried the weight of the whole battle. Everyone there knew what it meant. A quiet reminder of who this space belonged to and how hard I had fought to protect it. The next morning, I found someone had left a small basket by my front door. Inside was a bag of saltwater taffy, a hand-drawn card from one of the neighborhood kids, and a note that simply read, "Thank you for standing up." It wasn't signed. I smiled and placed the card on the fridge. Moments like that reminded me that while Karen had caused chaos, the neighborhood itself wasn't the enemy. Most people just wanted peace, a safe place to live, and a break from all the pettiness. I wasn't the only one who had felt trapped under the pressure of forced conformity. Still, Karen wasn't quite finished. That Monday, a letter arrived addressed to me from her lawyer. It was a cease and desist order claiming defamation of character and intentional public shaming. She demanded that I remove the article online and issue a public apology. My lawyer nearly laughed when he read it. He wrote a formal response citing the evidence already submitted to the sheriff, the zoning board, and the press. He also included a warning that any attempt to file a civil suit would result in a countersuit for harassment, legal costs, and emotional distress. We never heard back. By midweek, Karen's house had a for sale sign in the yard. The curtains were drawn, the lawn overgrown, and no cars sat in the driveway. Some said she had moved in with her sister permanently. Others speculated she was just waiting for the dust to settle. Either way, she was gone, and the silence she left behind was golden. The neighborhood began to breathe again without constant patrols, clipboard inspections, or tense meetings. People started waving more often. Small gatherings popped up on other porches. Sidewalk chats turned into longer conversations. It felt like something had healed. One afternoon, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw two teenagers skateboarding near the sidewalk. They waved. One of them asked if I was the pool guy. I laughed and said, "Sort of." They nodded and kept skating. Simple things like that meant a lot. No tension, no suspicion, just neighbors being neighbors again. Later that night, I sat in my usual chair by the pool, a cool drink in hand, feet in the water. The lights shimmered off the surface, casting soft ripples across the tiles. I looked around at everything I had built and defended, the gate, the garden, the quiet. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was simply content. For a long time, I had thought peace came from avoiding conflict, but now I knew better. Sometimes peace has to be earned. Sometimes you have to draw the line. And sometimes you have to install a steel gate and float a big inflatable sign in your pool to remind the world whose land this really is. About 2 weeks after Karen's house went up for sale, I got a call from my lawyer that made me raise an eyebrow. Apparently, Karen had tried one last trick before skipping town. She had filed a small claims lawsuit against me for emotional distress and damage to her reputation. Her complaint said I had turned the neighborhood against her, created a hostile environment, and publicly humiliated her through the article that featured our dispute. My lawyer chuckled as he read the details, but I didn't find it funny. It was insulting. After everything she had done, the fines, the trespassing, the vandalism, the lies, she now wanted sympathy from a court. I told my lawyer to do whatever needed to be done and added that I was absolutely filing a counterclaim. The court date came quickly. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when I walked into the small municipal courtroom, papers in hand. Karen sat at the front, her expression neutral but clearly forced. She wore a gray suit, her hair pinned tight, and didn't look at me once. Her lawyer spoke first, rattling off claims about my supposed smear campaign and the mental strain it had caused her. They painted a picture of a poor community servant who had simply been misunderstood and unfairly targeted. When it was our turn, my lawyer calmly laid out the facts. He showed printed evidence of the letters she sent, the security footage of her breaking into my backyard, the public records that proved I wasn't part of the HOA, and even screenshots of her social media comments from the anonymous account we had traced back to her IP address. The judge listened quietly, flipping through the files, nodding now and then. Then came the moment that sealed everything. My lawyer played the video again, the one showing Karen sneaking into my yard, cutting the lock, and dumping soap into my pool. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the projector. When it ended, the judge looked directly at Karen and asked if she had any explanation. She didn't say a word, just sat there with her lips pressed so tightly together they turned white. The judge dismissed her case on the spot and warned her that filing frivolous lawsuits was a misuse of court time. Then he turned to our counterclaim and, after reviewing the harassment evidence, ruled in our favor. Karen was ordered to pay $18,000 in damages and legal fees. She was also required to issue a written apology to me and submit it to both the HOA board and the county records office. After court, I walked past her without saying a word. She didn't look up. I didn't need to gloat or make a scene. The legal system had done its job, and that was more satisfying than any insult I could have delivered. I went home, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat on the porch in complete silence. The storm was over, not just the public battle, but the quiet, gnawing tension that had followed me for months. The kind of stress that wears you down in layers. That day marked the first time in a long while I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder or check the cameras every few hours. A week later, Karen's house sold. A moving truck arrived in the early morning, and a few tired-looking men loaded boxes and furniture into it. Karen wasn't there. Someone else oversaw the process. A real estate assistant, maybe, who worked fast and didn't speak to anyone. By sundown, the house was empty. The curtains had been pulled down, the flower pots gone, the door left propped open for one final sweep. I stood by my gate and watched from a distance. There was no celebration, no satisfaction, just a deep breath of relief. Not for her departure, but for what it meant. It was finally done. The new neighbors who moved in a few days later were a young couple with a toddler and a dog that barked more than it should. They introduced themselves right away, brought over muffins, and asked politely if the fence was there for a reason. I gave them the short version of the story, and they laughed, saying it sounded like something out of a TV show. I said it had felt like one. We got along just fine after that. Meanwhile, the HOA board made some big changes. They sent out a letter announcing a complete review of all past fines issued under Karen's leadership. A lot of residents got refunds or had bogus charges erased from their record. A new committee was formed to revise the bylaws, this time with public input and clear boundaries. They even invited me to participate in a few of the review sessions. I declined the formal role, but did send over a few notes about respecting private property and preventing leadership abuse. It felt good to be heard without having to fight for it. A few local news outlets followed up on the story, especially after the court ruling became public record. One article referred to me as the man who locked down his pool and won. Another described the whole thing as a lesson in boundary setting, literally and figuratively. I wasn't looking for fame or attention, but I couldn't deny there was something satisfying about knowing my side of the story had reached people beyond the neighborhood. I received a letter from a man in another state who said my story inspired him to challenge his own abusive HOA president. He enclosed a photo of a sign he had hung on his backyard fence that read, "Not your pool either." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Despite everything, I never stopped enjoying the simple things. The quiet mornings when the mist rose off the water, the way the wind rustled through the trees while I read a book by the deck, the smell of burgers on the grill during family visits. My granddaughter swam more often now, less afraid of the grown-up drama that had once loomed over our get-togethers. She called the inflatable sign her favorite part of the pool and begged me never to take it down. That inflatable stayed there through summer and into the early days of fall. One crisp afternoon, I floated beside it, arms spread, eyes closed, letting the sun warm my face. I thought about all that had happened, the fences, the meetings, the courtrooms and letters, and locked gates. It had been exhausting, but it had also been necessary. The peace I now enjoyed wasn't just something I found. It was something I had built fought for, and finally secured. There was no HOA rule, no clipboard, no tantrum that could take it away from me now. I didn't hate Karen. I didn't wish her any harm, but I hoped that wherever she ended up, she learned something about limits, about boundaries, about how far is too far. And I hoped that the next time she saw a fence, she didn't see defiance, she saw protection. Because sometimes that's all a fence really is, not a wall to keep people out, but a line drawn to say, this is mine, and you don't get to control it. Not anymore. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the final piece of this long story landed in my mailbox. An envelope with no return address, just my name written in tight, careful handwriting. I opened it slowly, already suspecting who it might be from. Inside was a single page, neatly folded. It was a letter from Karen. She didn't open with any excuses or flowery apologies. She simply stated that she was sorry for everything. She admitted that she had let her role as HOA president get to her head, and that she had acted out of control and pride. She wrote that losing her position, her house, and the respect of the community had forced her to face the damage she caused, not just to me, but to everyone around her. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said she hoped I had found the peace she never managed to create for herself. I read the letter twice and sat with it in my hands for a long time. A part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend it never came. But another part of me, the part that had already moved on, felt something softer. Not sympathy, but maybe understanding. Karen had fought so hard to control something that was never hers to begin with, and in doing so, she lost the one thing she claimed to value most, her community. I didn't frame the letter or respond to it. I folded it back up, placed it in a drawer, and left it there. It wasn't closure I needed anymore. I already had it. With Karen long gone and the HOA restructured, life in the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm. The new board members were respectful and transparent, and they worked hard to rebuild trust. They sent out surveys, held informal gatherings, and made it clear they wanted to serve, not rule. One of them even asked if I would be willing to give a short talk at the next meeting about property rights and the importance of clear boundaries. I politely declined again, but told them I appreciated the gesture. I had no interest in being a symbol or a spokesperson. I was just a man who built a pool and wanted to swim in peace. My pool, once the center of conflict, had now become a gathering place again. My granddaughter swam there every weekend. Neighbors dropped by now and then with lemonade or stories, and no one asked for permission. They just came to visit, not to inspect or criticize. One day, the couple who bought Karen's old house came by with their toddler and asked if it was all right to set up a small inflatable pool for their kid in the backyard. I smiled and told them it sounded like a perfect idea. The dad laughed and said he had no intention of joining the HOA board anytime soon. We both understood the weight of that joke without needing to say anything more. One afternoon in late October, I decided to take down the big inflatable sign that had floated in the center of the pool for months, not because it no longer meant anything, but because it had already said enough. I let it deflate slowly, folded it, and stored it away in the garage. In its place, I added a small wooden plaque on the fence that simply read, "By invitation only." It was subtle, but it made the point clear. The pool was open, the heart was open, but the gate stayed locked unless I turned the key. As the seasons shifted, so did the feeling of the place. Fall brought a crisp wind, and the trees along the fence turned golden and red. The pool, though still cleaned and cared for, saw less activity. I spent more time reading on the deck, wrapped in a light blanket, sipping coffee as the morning fog rolled in. I reflected often during those moments, not on the battle itself, but on the strange way life worked. How something as simple as a swimming pool could unravel a web of control that had gone unchecked for too long. How standing firm, even quietly, could inspire others to do the same. I got a message from Todd one evening letting me know the HOA board had finalized its new charter. They removed the outdated clauses, clarified jurisdiction lines, and implemented a rotating leadership system so no one person could hold too much power for too long. They even added a clause called the Open Land Respect Policy, inspired by what they called the pool incident. I chuckled at that. I never imagined my quiet retirement would leave behind anything official, much less a named clause in an HOA document. One evening, as I watched the sun dip behind the trees and the water shimmer with fading light, I thought about everything that had been lost and gained. I never wanted conflict. I never wanted to make a statement. I just wanted to be left alone to enjoy the life I had worked hard to build. And yet, through confrontation, I ended up with something better than silence. I found community, not the kind Karen tried to force, but the real kind. The kind that grows from mutual respect and clear boundaries. Neighbors stopped by not to complain, but to share. We exchanged seeds for the garden, traded stories about tools, and sometimes sat on the porch and listened to the wind. No one brought up the past unless it was to laugh. Even the sheriff's deputy who helped me file that first report dropped by once, off duty, to say he was glad things turned out the way they did. He said it was one of the few times he had seen a case like that actually end in peace instead of more fighting. I suppose that's what this was all about from the beginning. Peace. Not silence, not surrender, just peace. And to get it, sometimes you have to hold the line. You have to say no. You have to build the fence and bolt the gate and float a sign in your pool that says what your words alone cannot. Because eventually the noise fades, the drama ends, the storm moves on, and all that remains is you, the water, and the sky above, wide and open, and finally still.